Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Stories Are What Save Us, a conversation about constructing our narratives and finding our voices. My name is Roland White. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the University of Chicago. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. But before I begin, I'd like to briefly share some remarks to set the stage. This past spring, I was a student in Dave and Krissinger's Writing for Public Policy Professionals course. During the course, Professor Krissinger pushed our class to consider how we write about trauma, both in our lives and when we advocate for the interests of others. There are two things I want to highlight about what I learned. First, Professor Krissinger's class taught me to seek the connectedness in our stories. In class, I wrote two pieces about the effects of anti-crime policies and mass incarceration on Afro-descendant and indigenous communities in Latin America. While writing those papers, Professor Krissinger pushed me to envision a world that centered the victims of state violence and to ask what better outcomes for these groups could look like. Through that work, I began to see myself and others in the experiences of communities in Latin America, including experiences of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, the effects of the slave trade on social hierarchies, and efforts to secure equitable housing, healthcare, and education. I learned that internationalism and solidarity have long connected seemingly dispersed movements for justice, including global struggles for women's rights, in defense of Black lives, and against carceral logic. These struggles, while different from place to place, reflect that some issues extend across geographic borders and connect all those seeking to live full, safe, free, and dignified lives. In seeking to elevate Black and Indigenous experiences in Latin America, I was simultaneously uplifting the voices of communities experiencing trauma, the trauma of violence, and fighting for justice in the US. This leads to my second takeaway from Professor Krissinger's class. That is the importance of purpose in one's writing. During class, Dr. Brian Williams visited as a guest speaker and described how he deals with trauma in his work as a surgeon. He said that he's motivated to keep going in work that's exceedingly difficult because he knows that what he's doing is important and he's guided by a clear purpose. Dr. Williams, I'm sure like others on our panel, allows his why to push him forward each day. This is an important theme that's since stuck with me and one that our panelists will discuss tonight. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for the evening. First, we have Mr. David Krissinger, author of the new book, Stories Are What Save Us, A Survivor's Guide to Writing About Trauma. In his book, Mr. Krissinger weaves together his journey as a writer, editor, and teacher with tools and storytelling structures to process trauma and conflict. Mr. Krissinger leads the writing program at the Harris School of Public Policy and is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine and The War Horse. We would also like to welcome Dr. Brian Williams, a highly skilled surgeon specializing in trauma surgery, acute care surgery, and surgical critical care at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Williams is the founding program director of the Adult Surgical Critical Care Fellowship, co-director of the Surgical Intensive Care Unit, and an instructor of racial disparities in healthcare at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. And finally, we would like to welcome Dr. Gina Fedock, an assistant professor in the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, where she focuses on improving women's mental health. Her work spans the boundaries of public health, criminal justice, law, and social work. And her research includes implementing, testing, and evaluating interventions that are designed to improve the quality of women's health in the community and within correctional settings. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Ms. Angie Ricketts. Ms. Ricketts is the author of No Man's War, A Reverent Confessions of an Infantry Wife, and the author of the afterword for Mr. Krissinger's upcoming book. Ms. Ricketts uses storytelling to shine a light on experiences that many people face but rarely think they can talk about in polite society. She holds a master's degree in social psychology and human relations and an undergraduate degree in sociology. Over to you, Angie.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Jeez, I didn't mean to put this. Can you hear me? What's going on?
We can hear and see you, Angie. You're good.
Oh, you can hear me, you can see me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, we're good.
My amygdala, my trauma amygdala, right? Okay, so that was a great start. I would just like to start by saying how interesting this is and what a wide range of people we have talking about this word called trauma. That to me, I wrote in the afterword of Dave's amazing book, the word trauma has almost become like the word resilience. It's so, we need more words for it. We need more synonyms. We need more specific words for it. And I met Dave, I believe it was 2016, in Los Angeles at a book conference. And 2 weeks earlier, I had found out that my oldest child, who was just about to graduate from high school, an all-state soccer player in Colorado and was headed to West Point, had a 1 in a million brain tumor. And I decided to go to that conference, and I was gone, for 36 hours. And I just, it was, my body was there, but my mind was not. But I just remember Dave and I sitting and talking about trauma and what it meant. And we always stayed in touch. And that's kind of been our thing, trauma and mental health. So ironically, 3 years later, when he asked me to write the afterword for this book, my son was hospitalized again. He's hanging on. He's a tough kid, but it's been a long and hard journey. So Dave asking me to write this was very personal to me, and that is why I wrote it. But I would like to ask Dave, and I sort of know the answer to this, but I want you to tell everybody, Dave, what the chain of events was that prompted you to write this book.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. This is, this is the author's dream, right? Of the release party and getting to see, other people excited about the work. It's kind of a lonely job to be a writer. And so this is, one of the few times, we interact with people on a regular basis. So, so that being said, I started working in the space of, teaching people writing, and specifically writing about themselves in 2014. And so by the time Angie and I had met, I was teaching college courses and teaching workshops around the country, mostly for military veterans, their family members, refugees, rape survivors, people who had some really, really difficult backgrounds and histories. And the thing that kind of, always really inspired me to keep doing that work was how impactful it was for people to find a way to kind of wrap their arms around their story and bring some coherence to the experience. And that's not to say that, everyone's going to have a sort of tidy beginning, middle, end, where everything turns out all right in the end. That's not reality, right? And this is something Angie and I have talked about so much over the course of our relationship together is, is there even such a thing as happy endings? And so that's something that I've explored in my writing and my teaching. And then when I came to the Harris School in 2019, there were a few things that I noticed right away about lots of the students that I was working with. The first thing I noticed was many students have maybe not a necessarily traumatic experience, but they have some kind of experience with a policy area where people are experiencing really negative outcomes or traumatic, or they're having traumatic experiences, and that's really what got them interested in public policy. And they come to Harris because they want to make the world a better place. And I get so excited about working with people like that. And the next question would be sort of like, well, how much can I bring myself to this work, right? How much does my my story affect my work and the way that I see the world? And and so I really kind of set out writing, trying to understand my own background and why do I do this work, and why do I sit with people and go through some of the worst days of their life, and why do I keep coming back to this. And there's definitely a family history that I had to make sense of, lots of experiences with students that I was trying to better understand. And I thought, well, if I can sort of tell my story and also show other people how they could do that too if they wanted to, that maybe that would be a thing that could work. That would be a book that people would find valuable. And then what I found as I was teaching students how to do that was, not only did it help them feel better or have a better understanding of their own past, but I think it helped them see other people differently as well. And especially in public policy, where it can be really easy to kind of hide behind data and hide behind analysis and not really necessarily interact with the people that your work is going to affect. I wanted to be able to give students kind of a toolkit that they could use to understand where other people are coming from and understand how traumatic experiences they might have undergone are going to affect them, and how that's going to affect how they see policy and how they interact with the world and how they view different institutions. And it just seems like there's all this really rich data and evidence that can be found in people's stories. And I wanted to figure out a way to teach other people how to do that. So that's where the book came about. And so I'm excited that it's now out in the world, and people are putting some of these tools into practice.
I'm very proud of you, and I'm so happy that this is just, it's such a great thing. I remember the first time I met you, it was a group of war writers, and we were all like in a bar, and I remember you sitting there and asking you, what service you or how you served, and then just kind of laughing, and because I was a spouse who'd written a book, so I kind of felt a little bit out of it too. But it's just, it takes a lot of chutzpah to do what you do. And you've really always been very steadfast in your mission and your story and how you want to help people. I would like to start my first question with Brian, only because, well, for many reasons, but one of them, I'm very fascinated by your work. And how what does that mean? I mean, tell me what trauma means to you, and tell me what you do with the trauma that you see every day, if you can.
Well, again, thanks for the invitation to be on the panel today, and congratulations, David, on your book. So to answer your question about what trauma means to me, how I define that has certainly evolved over the course of my career as a trauma surgeon. I will say for the bulk of my 20-something years in medicine, when I thought about trauma in relation to my work, I would think about the physical forces that cause damage to bodies, whether it's from a gunshot or a stabbing, a motor vehicle collision, a workplace incident. It was something caused force, caused injury, and then it was my job as a trauma surgeon to identify the injuries and somehow fix that. And it was not too recently, in the last few years, where I started to make the connection between that physical trauma and the psychological trauma that can exist separately from that or together and amplify each other. So that's what I love about academic medicine and being in academia, is that you're always learning and you're forced to stay up to date with information and get really challenged about your beliefs to be the best that you can be. So for me now, trauma it's a very heterogeneous word, and listening to David talk about it from his standpoint was very interesting to what I talked about it. And I think mostly of, again, injuries to bodies and broken bones and blood and potential death, and what I can do to ameliorate that. But I'm having a great appreciation for the psychological trauma that can exist separate from physical trauma, but also can come as a result of the trauma as well. So I'm using that to try to make myself a better doctor to treat the whole patient, not just the injuries themselves.
And if I could just get a little bit personal, but I think that what you're describing is secondhand trauma. And how do you cope with that? What do you do?
Yeah, so for yes, I've seen a lot of injuries
Mhm.
to people that, we none of us expects to wake up and go to work and then possibly not come home that night or lose someone that we care about due to some unexpected traumatic injury. So I have met people on the worst days of their lives, whether they are the families of survivors or they are survivors with debilitating injuries. And for a long time, I was able to compartmentalize that and separate that from the work I had to do.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if that's healthy, but that's the way my mind had functioned for a long time. I will say that by training, I'm an engineer. My prior career was an aeronautical engineer, so I like things that are straight lines, the numbers add up, things go into the boxes that they belong in, and that doesn't always work in medicine. You're dealing with humans on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Uh, so now I recognize that it does impact me, uh, but I don't want to lose that feeling, because the day I stop caring about that, or I don't feel that sort of uh, sorrow for another family or patient that's been injured or died, that means I've lost my humanity and I need to find another job. So that sort of pain lets me know that I'm still alive and I'm still doing the right thing when I go to work every single day.
I think you've just described apathy, right?
Right.
Right. And so, but yeah, compartmentalizing it is um, is legit and it's working. But just so you know, compartmentalizing to me is almost like a storage space that you've rented and that you have to pay for every month. And eventually, you're going to have to take your stuff out of storage. Eventually, you're going to have to deal with the things that you've compartmentalized.
Or it will overflow, right? It
Right.
will burst at the seams when you
And
least
you don't want to
expect
pay
it
more
or
for a
want it
bigger
to.
storage space. Right.
Right,
That's right.
right.
That's right. But I hear that I mean, from what I understand, I don't think it's a secret that you're right. You're writing a memoir that actively.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Okay.
Uh, I have a draft done. I'm actually going through some edits right now, and the thing about writing
Mhm,
is, like David said, it's a solitary process, and
mhm.
for most readers, and I was one of those, you see the book and you think, oh wow, they just sat down, wrote this book, and now here it is. But you don't see all the hours and agonizing in the background over the craft of writing, and there's a story being well told. And for a memoir, you really, at least my goal is to not just say, okay, here's what happened to me. What do you think? It's here's what happened, here's what I've learned, and here's what I hope you can learn from this to use in your life. Because you really want to do is not just tell the story, but to bring the reader into the story with you and
Right.
see the world through your eyes and say, oh, I can learn this, I can do that. And it's some, you want to give a gift to the reader, not just hand them a diary of your daily events, but
Right.
like, here's what I went through, here's what I've learned. Hopefully you can learn something as well.
Yeah. Having written a memoir, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's a very gutting process. And then when you're done with it and you give it to the world, what you will find is that the world can interpret it however they see it. And it might
Exactly.
not be at all how you meant it. And that's a whole fascinating thing. Um, just, beyond that. But um,
Which can be a bit scary too, right? That's you're kind of
well,
you're
yeah, and
you're putting yourself out there.
it is, yes, you're putting yourself out there, and um, y- you're a character. You turn yourself into a character.
Right.
You're your own protagonist and antagonist. And if you show your own flaws, then it's okay to show other people's flaws. But at the end of the day, and this was the thing that Dave and I talked about with his book, nobody wants to read a what memoir? A misery memoir. No one wants to do that. And that's where that whole like feeling that the pressure to tie it up in a nice little bow, even if you're sort of making it up.
Yes.
And that's another gutting feeling in itself. But you know, you want people to read your book. You don't want them to feel like, oh God, I'm just gonna go kill myself. It just feels like the most miserable. You know, like The Glass Castle. It was the greatest book, but God, it was depressing. But somehow there was redemption in there, you know, somewhere. So I kind of always think of that.
Right.
And Roland, I'm going to get to you in a second. I'm one of the things I like about you so much is that you are clearly the next generation. And that's so impressive to me because you're going to get to carry this torch of trauma writing and policy all into the future. But so Gina, can I shift to Gina?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Your work is completely fascinating, especially as you know, as it pertains to women. Just you know, because I am one, but I think that the gender definitions of trauma, it's a blurry thing, and you know, I don't quite know what the answer to that is or what to say about that, but I, from what I've read about you, you have some opinions and some knowledge, and tell us about that. And I'd also like for you to tell us what it means to be trauma informed.
So first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I really appreciate it, and congratulations, David, on your book. And congratulations, Brian, on a draft. That's one. That's huge. And so, Angie, your question about trauma and gender, what I'm hearing is sort of what's the connection? How do we want to understand it? So, first of all, my research really focuses on women who are involved in the criminal legal system and understanding their experiences across the life course, in particular, understanding their experiences of trauma. So my background is a clinical social worker, and I come from doing practice in the sense of working with organizations and supporting survivors of sexual and domestic violence. And so for me, whenever I first started this sort of research pursuit and doing, when I first started doing some facilitation work with groups with women who are incarcerated, in particular women who are serving time for violent offenses, I sat in those groups facilitating, but really learning. I mean, it's such an active process of growing and learning. And my ideas of trauma expanded and deepened as they shared about what had happened across their life course and around what they were experiencing within the prison itself. Several of the women I worked with were serving life sentences, and the prison, for the most part, was their home. Many of them had been a part of a class action lawsuit around sexual abuse by correctional staff while they were incarcerated. So taking a moment of recognizing that I'm sitting in a group with women who are serving life sentences, some of whom had the courage to speak up about the abuse that they were experiencing, why they continued to live with the people that were abusing them. And so for me, when I think about, I just want to say, first of all, my understanding of trauma comes from these experiences of practice and in doing research, and to continually ask, sort of as Roland talked about, you know, really being aware and listening to stories and thinking about how can I deepen and nuance and how can I hold complexity. To me, it's always about holding complexity. So when I think about trauma, I don't want us to get stuck in ranking or thinking about what's worse or what's best, or that only some people experience some forms. A lot of the women with whom my work is based, I mean, they're women who've experienced multiple forms of oppression and harm. Their abuse has been experienced by agents of the state, by parents, by caregivers, by child welfare workers, by teachers. You know, it's so pervasive. And so many of them are experiencing racism, sexism, abuse based on their gender identity, other, you know, arranged on their sexual identities. So when I think about trauma, I think about the ways in which it may be gendered in terms of who is allowed, what sort of ideas do we have about what forms of trauma are acceptable, and I put that in quotes, for certain, what have we said is okay for women to express as trauma? What have we said is okay for men to express as that? What have we undervalued? Brian, as you were talking about understanding the psychological effects, how do we believe people? Whose pain do we sort of validate and legitimize?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been like understanding, first of all, that center of like believing someone and being present to them, and then also understanding sort of forces of gendered social control and racialized social control that are harmful. So to me, I think of like gender as beyond just an individual level, but really thinking about it in terms of even what we think of as trauma and what we sort of validate as that, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it also feeds into like my belief that we just need other words. We need a wider vocabulary to express the various forms of trauma. It's like resilience. If I hear resilience, I've stopped listening to you, because I hate that word. I think of it, to me, resilience is buoyancy. Because that's a lot more active. So that means you're under and you come back up. That's resilience. That's buoyancy. And
can I add something in there, Angie?
yeah,
To what
I love it.
Regina was saying about not comparing the traumas. I think that's so important, because we get into this cycle of a friend of mine called it the trauma Olympics. Like, your trauma was only this, so you should get over it, but mine was this, mine is worse than yours. And it's not about what happened, but it's your response to it. That's what matters. And that's what we need to focus on, is these individuals and the responses to the traumas, not us defining how they should respond to the trauma.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And as a memoirist, we, when our son became sick, we lived in Colorado. My husband was a 30-year Army Ranger and did 8 combat deployments, and it didn't matter where we lived. So we decided to move to this sleepy town, Bloomington, Indiana, where I had gone to college. And I found very quickly that I had almost nothing in common with anybody, because to them, trauma was, my car broke down by the side of the road and I was so terrified, and I'm seeing a therapist now about it. And I was like, what? But, and I'm not comparing those things, but you compare them. It's human nature to hear other people's trauma and think about it as your own, and then kind of reevaluate and and I think that what's so special about you, Brian, is that you have this marriage of physical trauma and psychological trauma. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but that's a lot of responsibility for you with your book to kind of to meld those things together. And I think that Dave's book did a great job of writing lessons about trauma, or telling lessons about trauma writing. And I was just talking to my mom about this the other night, and my mother is a psychiatric nurse practitioner who works with very, very the sickest population. And she's loving Dave's book, and she's just, each chapter she wants to talk to me about, but she loves the way that he takes his own story and kind of weaves you into it and teaches you something in a way that you don't feel like you're being taught to, because he's telling you a story too. And then all of a sudden you realize, hey, I just kind of learned something from that. Yeah, so Gina, I am very interested in, and this is something I don't know, I don't think we have time to talk about, but I'd love to talk to you about domestic abuse. And I live in, I don't know if you've heard of a place called Middleway House. It was founded here in Bloomington, and there's a movie being made about the founder of it right now, but it's a place for women escaping domestic violence. And I always wonder what the socioeconomic background of those women is. You know, like, where do they come from, and what takes them there, and what takes them there as opposed to going to family, and all of those kind of things. But I'm getting sidetracked. So okay, let's see. I would like to pivot. I was so interested in Roland. And Gina, you're the next generation too. I mean, you guys have a lot, and with COVID, we haven't even talked about COVID. So Dave's book came out like what, a perfect time. So there, when we were talking about writing it, and when he asked me to write the afterword, we had a slice of the pie that we were sort of talking to, right? But we're all traumatized. COVID has traumatized everyone. No one is untouched by this to varying degrees. So,
Angie, can I hop in for a second?
Yeah.
Because I'd love to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a couple of questions too that people have written in, so I wanted to touch on this. But there's always these kind of questions of like, well, how do you do this without kind of re-traumatizing yourself? How do you do it without playing into stereotypes? How do you get people to see your story the way you want them to see it? And these are the kinds of questions that I've dealt with for years with students, because they're, I think people that are ready to tell their story, they want to have a good reaction, right? They want to feel a connection and understanding with the person that they're communicating with. But all too often, right, when we tell a story about something that we've experienced, it can feel very voyeuristic for the person you're sharing the story with, where they feel uncomfortable, they don't know what to do, they don't have experience with it. In the Midwest, right, we're very famous for the platitudes and the, oh well, everything happens for a reason, and I'm sure it'll, I'll pray for you, right? There's all these kind of platitudes that we give, and those can be really unsatisfying, when you're on the receiving end of it. And the way that I've come to think about this is like the difference between a confession and a confidence. And when I say a confession, I don't mean you did something wrong and you have to confess. It's the idea of the kind of, spilling your guts to, some authority figure, right? You're to a parent, to a spouse, to a priest, to a supervisor, just spilling it all out there.
mm-hmm.
And then the confidence is more like a conversation between friends, right? You're choosing to tell that story to someone who's really earned the right to hear that story, and who, the goal is about strengthening the relationship, not about exposing yourself, right? And another way I think about this is, if a confession is like spilling your guts, then a confidence is like rolling up your sleeve and saying, here's my scar.
Yeah.
And when you roll up your sleeve and say, here's my scar, what you're doing, right, is you're saying, do you have any scars that you want to show me?
Right.
And I always take that as the highest praise, honestly, of something that I write, is when someone emails me or sends me a message saying, I really want to tell you about something that happened to me, or I want to tell you about a friend, or I want to tell you about my father, because now we have a conversation, and that to me is the best outcome. And so sometimes it's a matter of people just not being ready, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have enough distance from the story, they don't have enough perspective yet. It can be too fresh, right? It can be that you don't know what you think about it, and so how can you possibly relay that to someone? And then another way that I like to approach this in my own story, personal memoir kind of writing, but also in policy writing, is the idea that that a good story is about change. It's about transformation, right? Something happens over the course of the story. It's not the same in the end as it is in the beginning. Otherwise, that's an anecdote, right? That right. Doesn't show anything. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, just removing trauma out of the equation altogether, and instead focusing on, tell me something that you've learned in your life. Tell me a way that you see the world differently today than you did when you were a child or when you were a young adult. Tell me how you better understand something that you used to not understand. And 9 times out of 10, there is some experience that that person had, whether it was a traumatic experience, whether it was just a difficult, challenging, frustrating, emotionally taxing experience that maybe we wouldn't label trauma, but there's a fracture, right? There's no longer wholeness, right? There's no longer peace. There's something different.
Mhm.
That's usually the building blocks, right, of a story. And so when I can ask someone, well, tell me something you learned, and then they tell me, I can say, all right, what's the story behind that?
What's your object of desire?
Yes.
That's your
What-
big thing.
Yes.
That's your
What-
big
yeah.
thing. Yeah.
What did you want? How did you try to get it? What happened? What got in your way? And how are you different now than you used to be? And I do this with, with policy at like sort of a more abstract level, right? It's like things are different today than they were 20 years ago. Okay, how did we get here? There were the moments where we had to make decisions, and what happened after that, and then what happened after that. And it's just kind of, again, wrapping your arms around something and saying, here's what I understand about it.
Yeah.
Can I add to that, Angie?
Yes.
So when you're talking about policy papers, Dave, I think like we're talking today about trauma and personal stories and things like that. But I think what you said about telling a story in something like a policy paper is equally important. I think it's even more effective, because before I started writing this memoir, most of my writing was scientific writing. It's very dry, straightforward. You do the introduction, here are your methods, here's your data, here's your conclusion. And the bar for publication is just, do you check all the boxes? But the ones that really drew me in the best were the ones that actually did that and told a story. And I think you could do that in scientific writing. You could do that with your policy papers. So storytelling in and of itself is a means of leading to change. So I think that's a kind of important point that was in there, what you were talking about as far as telling stories in other mediums besides just memoirs and books and such.
Mhm. Well, as the moderator, I'm going to shift to Roland here in a second, but I'd like to say something to that point. I began keeping a journal when I was 8 years old, every single day of my life. And when I was writing my memoir, I made lists of things that I wanted to write about and what I remembered about it. And then to me, I didn't care what kind of crap I took, because I felt like I was writing truth to power. I was writing about the side of military families in fighting 2 wars in 2 decades that was happening behind those stupid homecoming signs. I wanted to talk about that, and how it was just taking such a toll on all of us. But anyway, as I was writing, I would go back and compare my memory of what I had written to my journal. And it was shocking to me how I had remembered it, or I had stored it in my amygdala, is that right? But I'd stored it in my brain in a way that was palatable and something that I could live with. But then when I went back and read these journals and read it in black and white as it happened that day, it took my breath away. And that speaks to that compartmentalizing that you were talking about. I think that writing a memoir, you're just ripping your clothes off and saying, hey, if you relate to me, you relate to me. If you don't, then maybe you will down the road. You're just painting a picture of yourself that you have no control over once it's out there. So I could very easily talk about memoir writing forever and ever and ever, but let's go back to Roland. I would like to ask Roland to talk to us about how he sees what Dave has written, and having studied under Dave as it relates to public policy. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
Yes, absolutely.
You're so well spoken. You're such a cool kid. I hope your mom is proud of you.
She is. She wanted to come tonight, but she signed up a little too late.
Okay.
No, thank you so much for including me in the conversation. That's a question that I think I kind of continue to struggle with each day. And I guess for me, in a literal sense, I'm a student, but also in kind of the most, figurative sense, in that each day I sort of seek to learn from practitioners like all of those that are here on this panel. I think that in taking Professor Krissinger's class, it was one of the first times that I really engaged more deeply with this idea of trauma and started to think about it in the context as someone who's starting their professional career in public policy. One of the things that probably stuck with me most from the class, in addition to everything that we learned and also Dr. Williams' remarks, was another guest speaker that we had. That was Brian Kastner, who's a writer.
Oh yes, I know Brian. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a close friend of Professor Krissinger.
Yeah. You can't go through a conversation with Dave without him talking about Brian. That's the way. Yeah.
Yeah, we read a piece by him and it was phenomenal. But it talked about his efforts to document military interventions in Somalia, and specifically drone strikes that had a devastating impact on communities there and that weren't being documented by the government. And he shared some of his remarks about how he processes trauma in his life and in his work. And he had a certain approach, which was very much to try to separate himself as much as possible from his work, to ensure that he is a vehicle to uplift others' stories and to uplift their narratives in a way that, shines a positive light on, it shines a light in the way that needs to be shined on those groups, but that he doesn't take those things on himself. I thought that was really powerful. And it was something that I've since, continued to kind of wrestle with in what will be my own work. And that I think if I want to try to have an impact, if I want to try to adequately uplift the sort of needs, desires of marginalized communities, be those Black communities in the US, Indigenous communities, Latin American communities, sort of wherever, my journey takes me. That's something that I guess I want to constantly be conscious of is how I'm taking on that trauma in my own life, but also making sure that I'm doing justice in uplifting those voices. And also, having a career in which, we don't experience things like burnout, or recognizing when burnout is starting to occur, and taking steps to either scale back or to address that. So those are sort of my initial musings as a student, but as I said, I'm here to learn from the practitioners.
Well, I want to ask you two more things. First of all, did you read Shaka Senghor's book, Righting My Wrongs?
No, I haven't.
Brian, okay, Dave and I talked about this the other day. I probably shouldn't be plugging a book that has nothing to do with this, but he's this amazing, wonderful, just Shaka Senghor, Righting My Wrongs. Everybody get that. It's amazing. But so where do you see yourself first of all, how do you think that COVID will change your trajectory in your career, and where do you see yourself in 10 years with this? Or where would you like to see it in 10 years? And if you want to think about that, we can come back to it. You want to think about it?
I'll think about it. Yeah.
Okay. You think about that.
Angie, can I
Yeah.
interject? I'm really curious to hear from Gina about a little bit more, maybe about like the ethics around receiving these kinds of stories, and how to interact with people, right, when they're sharing these sorts of things, but then also what do you do with that story once you have it?
That's a wonderful question.
Yeah, what advice do you have for that kind of issue?
Right, and I think there was a question or two about not objectifying people's stories as well, and I think that's huge. So when I also think about trauma, I think about power. And I also want to say another word that keeps coming to mind as we're talking is healing and connection. I think I've been thinking, as you all have been talking about, how Judith Herman calls I think trauma, the disease of disconnection. And so even as you all were talking, I was like, some of that is, we have to also reconnect to ourselves after we've experienced trauma. So anyway, I just want to add that. But so yes, the ethics of holding people's stories, I think is huge. And there's a lot of work going on exactly how do we respond, what do we ask about, what do we not ask about if we're a researcher, a practitioner. So for example, I would tell you one of my, right before COVID, one of my research projects was interviewing incarcerated mothers. And it was specifically to create policy and practice changes. And the idea was, we want your voices at these meetings that are happening outside of this prison. And I can tell you the debates that we had as a research team of, do we talk to women who've lost custody of their children? If we're focusing specifically on policies and practices around parenting, do we interview those who've had their rights terminated? Do we interview those who no longer have contact? And we had some information, so we were purposefully sampling. And I'm a social worker, and this work is also very personal as well. And so for me, it was, I'm not going to sit there and just ask a list of questions and then sort of prop up these faces and stories at every meeting I come to. But really thinking about part of, whenever you asked earlier what trauma informed is, there's this notion of we understand what trauma is, but then there's ideas of being trauma responsive and moving beyond that, like how are we being transformative? And part of that is really committing to building trust. So to me, it's like, how am I using my power and my privilege? Honestly, before any of these types of events, when I'm writing, when I'm teaching, when I'm talking, when I'm listening, I imagine the women that I've talked to standing with me. They're who I'm accountable to. They trusted me with their stories. And so to me, it is the ethics of, as we were talking about, I don't want to share misery stories. And I also want to show agency, but also how do we balance those things, especially if we're trying to create change? And how do we make sure those stories aren't used against them? I saw there was another question back. What about if we have fear of retaliation? And it's like, yes, that's also coming from a place when so many of us have experienced trauma, we know it's not just one event. We get disbelieved, we experience further pain from that. And it can deepen the pain of what's already happened. So to me, it's the power of thinking about, first of all, what am I even asking about? What spaces am I in? Am I being trustworthy? Am I building relationships? What power and privileges do I have? What do I have access to? And what sort of change efforts am I working with others to do? So to me, it can't just be me deciding it alone, but thinking about really like truly change and working in solidarity and thinking about how am I going to establish trust and accountability, and even asking people, how do you want to present this? I also think a lot about how our stories change over time. Angie, as you were talking about your journals, and we know memory and trauma, there's a whole brain, there are studies around the brain and how we even can hold memories, and thinking about that reconnecting with selves. And so holding the space for people's stories to change over time, and understanding, so I just, to kind of summarize, like to amplify, to be transparent about my power, to be transparent about what I'm doing, to be thoughtful about it, to get feedback, and then to also be accountable, and to continue to sort of refine what I'm doing based on the feedback that I'm also receiving. I think it is tricky, especially, I know some of our attendees are work in nonprofits, where sometimes you have to show people's pain, they call it the pornography of pain. And so it's like, how do we not dehumanize people in that process? And I think part of that goes back to holding complexity and thinking about who are we working in solidarity with.
Well, and to me, that speaks to relatability. Sometimes there's a very lonely feeling with trauma, like,
Yes.
who else feels this way? And when you write your trauma, like Dave said, people come out of the woodwork and say, you wrote exactly what I've been thinking, but have been afraid to say. But
well, I think too, Angie, that a few things that help achieve that kind of response. And I'd be kind of curious to see if Brian, if you agree with this, and as you've been doing your drafting, but context is very, very important. And when I say context, I don't just mean, what's in their immediate surroundings, but like, cultural context and historical context and political context, and I'm working on this piece right now about the way that, remember when ISIS took over Syria and Iraq and they enslaved the Yazidi women and children and sold them, and, you know, just really some god awful, terrible things. Well, lots of like humanitarian organizations and journalists and nonprofits, they went into those spaces to interview survivors. And, you know, there are examples of, you know, asking really inappropriate questions to get, you know, kind of gratuitous or graphic details, right? To make the story a little punchier maybe, or a little more, you know, a little more intense. You know, not being careful about people's names and where they're from and who they're related to, and not understanding that, you know, you could publish a picture of a woman who escaped her captor, and then that captor sees the article and says, oh, that's where she is, I'm going to go back and get her, right? I mean, there's examples of that happening. Also understanding that, like, the Yazidi religion banishes women who have relations with men who are not Yazidis, even if it's rape. And so there were questions of like, are these women even going to be allowed to go back to their communities? And luckily that's something they did address. But, you know, so thinking about the context and about the people that you're writing about is really, really important. And if you don't know the context, then that's probably a good indication that you've got more work to do, you know, before you start interacting. And then I want to piggyback on something Gina said about, you know, thinking about agency, right? Like, people are more than just the worst thing that's ever happened to them. They're in the case of the Yazidi people, you know, they resisted, they ran away, they sabotaged things, they smuggled out messages. Like, they weren't just passive victims. And then also, you know, just being really careful about the language you choose, right? There's a difference between describing someone as a sex slave or as like a child bride, or, you're right, like certain language sort of almost legitimizes, you know, violence against women as like a legitimate form of warfare, right? Or like somehow, you know, gives it this normalcy almost. And so those are the things that I really think a lot about, is what is the language I'm using? What is the context in which the people I'm talking with are operating? And then the last thing I'll say, and then I want to hear Brian's thoughts on this too, is thinking about the future too. Like, I always like to ask people, like, what do you want the future to look like? You know, if you were in charge, you could just snap your fingers, like, what do you want? What, you know, back to the object of desire, what does a good life look like for you? And I think we make a mistake if we just assume that everybody wants the same thing.
Can I say something about that really quick?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we do, especially with veterans, is just kind of try to put them into categories of what it is that will help them. Some of them like to talk about it and connect with others. Some of them like to write about it. Some of them like therapy. Some of them do, you know, whatever the things are. My husband would rather die than sit in a circle and talk about war. What has helped him deal with his trauma is to stay here and help people. And each act of goodness that he does undoes one of the things that keeps him awake at night that he's done. And he's never verbalized that to me, but, you know, we've been married 30 years and I know that about him. And I've kind of, you know, he's not a writer, he's not a reader. It just, you know, but everybody deals with and processes trauma differently. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, I have also found that there's something about psychological trauma that just like, it just begets more psychological trauma. And it's not like you're looking for it, but it's just like, I don't know if it's God, if it's karma, if it's the world, but it's just like, the world doesn't just shit on you once. It's like, it picks someone and just does it over and over and over. I'm sorry, I said, yeah.
5 second delay.
Yeah.
So, you know, my therapist and I have talked about that, and I've talked about it with a lot of people. But you just it's almost like your brain, it's not that it seeks trauma, but you just, it becomes accustomed to this level of chaos and adrenaline, and it just, trauma feeds more trauma, right? Do you agree with that? Does anybody have anything to say about that?
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I hope
No,
you,
Gina, go ahead.
okay.
Um, I think that first, sometimes I think it's helpful to look at what have we learned is normal. So again, I'm thinking about, for those of us who grew up in homes in which there was abuse and neglect, when things are actually stable, it can feel very unsafe. And for those of us who kind of went through cycles of trauma, and the times when things were going well, we would brace ourselves for when they weren't going well.
Mm-hmm.
And be on edge. I mean, when we know that like trauma can heighten our senses, we know that trauma can cause us to like restrict and constrict our lives. It's about the losses, right? And so it can be, I just think that it becomes a process in which, again, what sort of becomes normalized, what do we start to expect of ourselves and of others? How much is it sort of shaping our daily interactions in ways that we may or may not be aware? So I immediately went to this idea of like constriction and thinking about what does even sometimes stability feel like, especially whenever we've experienced a lot of trauma.
Do you find that the people that you work with are re-traumatized by the same things over and over?
Well, it's interesting when you ask the first question about gender, what I should have also said is that when we talk about like gender-based violence, we also know that, for example, when we look at like rates of sexual abuse with kids, that girls have a much higher rate than boys. Again, that's not ranking. And then we also, when we look at a societal level, again, sort of how does social status linked to forms of abuse and violence that happen? And so when I think about, there are people based on our social location, how we're treated by others, how we're viewed, how we're talked down to, all these can be sort of reminders of trauma that we've experienced. Mm-hmm. And they can also contribute to having more experiences in which we're being ignored and we're rendered invisible when we're invalidated. And those are all memories or reminders of these other traumatic experiences we may have had. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think that kind of the demographic and just sort of the background of the person is so relevant and specific because I think that there are probably groups of women that you work with who feel more comfortable discussing their the trauma they've experienced and the abuse that they grew up with, and and then there are other groups that just don't talk about it. And how do you take, I think about this a lot. How do you take the groups where it's kind of been generational and they've discussed it, and like I said, trauma begets more trauma. And then I'd be wrong if I didn't talk about The Body Keeps the Score. I hope everybody has read that, right? I love him. He's amazing. But he talks about veterans and abuse, and that there is this silent group, and it breaks my own personal heart. Veterans who have suffered PTSD, and they also have this tremendously high rate of domestic violence. And for the spouses of those veterans who've experienced PTSD, they can't talk about it because you know what they're doing? They're selling out this American dream that their husband or spouse or wife, whatever, has sacrificed for. And that is a very lonely place. and that's not just one, that's just one that I'm, have kind of honed in on with Dr. Vessel. I heard him talk about that. And it stayed with me. I'm in great shape. I work out all the time. I've never smoked. I'm just, I had a full tilt heart attack and was medevaced to Vanderbilt University when I was 41 years old. My husband was doing his eighth combat tour. He was in Afghanistan. I had just run a 10-mile race. I had just done all of these things. I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought that I was having a panic attack. I was ashamed. I was horrified and embarrassed that, oh my God, I'm having a panic attack. We had, our brigade had lost 8 soldiers that weekend. So I was a little overwhelmed. Anyway, I didn't mean to launch into this, but I drove myself to the hospital because I was so embarrassed about this panic attack and that I didn't want anyone to think that Colonel Ricketts' wife is trying to get him to come home from Afghanistan because she had a friggin' panic attack and can't keep her, her stuff together. But to me, that's what, and anyway, so yeah, I went to Vanderbilt. They never figured out why I had a heart attack. They just sort of wrote it off as stress induced. But that took me to the body keeps the score. And we can internalize our trauma, or we can be brave enough to share it and connect with other people. But where is that? How do we bridge that gap between the group of folks who are willing to discuss and share and relate their trauma and connect with it to the people who feel isolated? And Gina, that's very specific to you.
Oh, it's
And Roland, you too. Brian, you not so much, but in a minute.
Well, first, I'm glad that you went to the hospital. I'm glad that you went to the hospital, and I'm glad that you're here today.
Yeah.
And I think your point around when we've been victimized, that there can be these family and societal. First of all, we know there's victim blaming, but it can also be breaking a taboo that these are not things that we talk about, or that we're betraying someone, or that we're betraying a system or an ideology, and it's real, right? Like this is how trauma keeps happening, especially when we're talking about abuse and this is not just from research. A lot of this is personal too, so that I just want to be very clear that it's not just anyone out there. I'm really using like we and us intentionally.
Yeah.
So I mean, I if I remember correctly, your questions about sort of there are people who may feel very isolated within that and don't want to talk about what they've experienced, right?
And how do we reach them?
Right. Well, I mean, I think part of what we've been talking about is that this process of healing is about connection, and there are multiple ways to connect. So even in terms of understanding community and understanding ourselves, I think part of it is recognizing that making it okay with there's not just one way. In being, I think, David, as you mentioned, like being present to each other's stories, that can sometimes be an invitation. Yeah. Sometimes a powerful thing is even just being able to say, I know, or yeah, like I've been there. And that can be just a profound moment.
Right. Just being seen and heard. Yeah. Yeah. And
to connect about it, just to even like, again, David, I'm going back to your example, like being of a confidant, like sharing that sort of scar, and the person who's listening, if they're not willing to share, ready to share about their own, and just being present to it can also be healing and cathartic in its own way. So I think goes back to, I think, Brian's point too, like healing doesn't happen in one specific way.
Is there something with public policy that can be, kind of, that can speak to that or handle, I'm not a public policy. I don't come from a public policy background. I come from, sociology and psychology. So public policy is very interesting to me, but is there a way that you can, even if you don't have the answer today, but just to kind of think about ways to connect the people, the silent, you know.
Ryan, I think you'd have something to say about that with, you know, with your background in deciding to tell your story, even on top of all the other things that you're already doing to try to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I just think if we look at, you're talking about public policy, I think just giving the policy makers or policy, students like Roland, the permission to bring themselves into the work they do, to bring their stories into the change they're trying to make, that is a huge step. To remain detached from what you're doing and separating your own humanity and your own story from the work you're trying to do, I think that makes us less effective in what we do. But to say, okay, I have this experience, I have this expertise, I have this knowledge, and I'm bringing that with me to the job I do every day, whether that's in public policy, in my field of medicine, sociology, social work, bring that to work, knowing that what you do impacts other human beings. That's how you can lead to much more effective change.
There's also a risk too, right? Because like when you do bring yourself, right, then, you know, I look at it this way. There's like two sides of the same coin. When I feel like my work gets really, really hard, I know that I have a why, like Roland mentioned in the beginning. Like, I know why I'm doing this work. I know that even though it's hard, it's still valuable for me to do it. But then it can also feel that much more demoralizing when you don't start to see progress, or when an institution or a program that you're affiliated with behaves in ways that are contrary to your story, right? And I think this is something I've been thinking a lot about for another project that I'm working on, is this difference between in the sort of military veteran community, the difference between like a post-traumatic stress and what we call a moral injury.
Yes.
Where the injury is not that you were necessarily in a life or death situation, or that you ended up on Brian's operating table, but like
we've talked about that a lot.
Yeah, something sort of like fundamentally was fractured within like your spiritual self.
Right.
And that's also, and not, it doesn't have to be religious, right? It can be, it's just that sort of, what's the point of the world, right?
Right.
And Brian, is that something you've used writing to help address? Because I know that that's a feeling you've shared before.
Absolutely. I mean, use the word demoralizing. I would say it can be infuriating when that occurs, right? Because it diminishes your value system, right? It's telling you that it doesn't matter. And you're right, it can't put you at risk. However, if what you are doing, if you know what your why is and stay focused on that and do what you do with integrity and consistency, that will help you propel those sort of challenging times. So that comes with the territory. You understand you will be paving new pathways for many people. And when they see you, you give them permission to have the same sort of courage. So focus on the why, stay consistent, and do it with integrity and with service. Then you may not be liked, you may not be championed, but you can't be said that you're wrong for what you did.
Right. That's wonderful. And that kind of, I'd made a note about this before. I don't think that we are ever, trauma is going to happen, and it's probably going to get worse. I mean, we're facing this uncertain future with, I don't know. I don't even want to say
climate change and everything.
Yeah, all kinds of. So we're not going to change that the existence of trauma, but maybe what we can do to help it is to create, and you guys are prime examples, to create a sense of community and connectiveness that helps the people who feel isolated and maybe disenfranchised for whatever reason, and just I mean, in terms of public policy, that's what I would like to see the next generation sort of bring to this a lack of just reduce the shame that is and stigma of trauma. I think a lot of people say who admit that they have trauma, unlike, a gunshot wound to the chest, but psychological trauma or whatever, it's a weakness. It's admitting a weakness, and we need to. How do you guys see a future where that's not a weakness? Anybody?
I mean, I can.
I
Oh, go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
David, no, your book, your show. You go first.
Well, so there's actually, this is something that I talk about in my policy writing class. There's some research that's been done by a couple of professors at Northwestern University looking at kind of different sorts of stories or different kinds of messages that people tell and what kind of effect that has on the receiver of it. And one thing that they find in their work is that when you give the reader or the viewer like an understanding of, how did we get into this mess in the first place? That's really, really important. Being able to point to a future that where things can be better if certain changes are made. So giving someone that hope that this isn't the end of the story, right? That it's, yes, there may be challenges ahead, but humans are, I'm not going to say resilient, adaptable. We're really good at being buoyant, right? And sort of naturally gifted at that, right? And then also being able to show that other people have made it through this, right? That there is a model that can be followed. But all of those things are shown to really increase the impact of a message, because you're not leaving people feeling doom and gloom. You're leaving them feeling like things are difficult, but they're not impossible.
Something that gives me hope is, I'm a Gen Xer, and I grew up with my father was also a career Army officer. So, I just screwed up for a lot of reasons. But anyway, I just grew up in this very rigid, you're a boy, you're a girl place. And my youngest daughter is free to admit that she's non-binary, and it's totally cool. And I ask her questions about that all the time. Do you feel more like a boy today or a girl today? And she's like, Mom, that's not how it works. But it's just, it's this weird thing that I can't quite comprehend. And I'm trying so hard, but I hope that maybe somehow in the future, trauma will follow that path, and that we'll be able to say, very comfortably, these are the things that I've been through, and this is not a competition. And I am not trying to one up you with my horrifying existence or my, this is not a competition, but this is a way to connect and make us more ourselves, be more authentic and live a more courageous presence.
That's a fantastic note for us to end on, because I just noticed we're at our time.
Oh, we are?
Yeah, that's our time.
Michael, I can't read the questions. Do we have questions?
Well, we already did our questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
we're at the end of our time.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to thank everyone, Dr. Williams, Professor Fedak, Roland, Angie. This has been such a treat for me. I'm so glad I got to do this with friends and got to make some new friends. And thank you everyone for tuning in. There is going to be a recording. It'll be posted on the Harris School YouTube channel. So if you feel the need to revisit it or to share it, again, thank you all. If you're interested in buying the book, it's available wherever you buy books, and there's actually a very special version that's signed by me through the Seminary Co-op bookstore. So if you are anxious to get my signature on the book, that's the best place to order it.
Say the title again, David. What's the title?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The title is Stories Are What Save Us. And it's a survivor's guide to writing about trauma. And Angie wrote the afterword, which my mother read this book in one sitting. And then she texted me and she said, I think Angie and I are going to be best friends. So
She sent me a lovely note. I just got this email yesterday. She's awesome. And I don't know if we're off now, but Dave and I are trying to plan something here in Bloomington, like a reading or an event. And I would open invitation to everybody. I have a huge house. We've got all kinds of places, and it'd be great to have all of you kind of come down here and talk about this with actual glasses of alcohol in our hands.
I like you, Angie. I like you.
Yeah. All right. Well, are we done? That was great. It was so fun. I've been a nervous wreck all day. Are we done?
I'm not sure if we're okay. Now we're ending.
Okay. But yeah, thanks again. And yeah, Dave Dave didn't even talk about his Ernie Pyle book. I mean, for God's sakes.
Well,
Just
that's
real quick. Just
a whole other combination.
do you want me to do it?
Well, I mean, it's in the same vein, right? It's about this a writer from World War II who saw some of the worst things that anybody can see, and then what had the job of trying to translate that to people that had no conception of it whatsoever. And so that's what drew me to him in the first place. And then it turns out he's a wonderfully complex and very nuanced and broken in many ways person himself. And I don't know, I always sort of gravitate towards people like that, I think, because I don't know, they have some sort of like special knowledge about the world. There's something about us broken folks,
Right.
we see the world in a different way, or we are able to articulate it in a specific way that anybody who can do that, I'm in awe of.
Mm-hmm. Until Dave told me, I actually was a student of the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism for a whole semester until my grades dropped for partying reasons, and I was dropped from the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism and switched it major. Anyway, I had no idea who Ernie Pyle was. I learned about it.
Pyle didn't even graduate from Indiana, so you're in good company.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, we love
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy your
Thanks,
dinner.
Yeah. Indiana just
Thank you so much.
loves to take credit for Ernie Pyle every chance they get.
Thank you so much again.